I want to be honest with you right from the start. When the Academy press office approved my embedded correspondent pass for the Unified Enrollment Program, I didn't think I was walking into anything particularly interesting. I'd covered 3 previous enrollment cycles. I'd written about the Deathworld Cadet who could echolocate through a kilometer of solid rock. I'd written about the twin Silhari sisters who graduated at the top of their class, despite their species having no concept of competitive ranking. I thought I'd seen everything the galaxy's military academies had to throw at a journalist. I had not. The Unified Enrollment Program, UEP, as the Academy staff called it, was the Galactic Accord's answer to a problem it had been quietly ignoring for about 40 years. The fact that most military academies train species in isolation. Crethari trained with Crethari, Silhari with Silhari, Thuven with Thuven, and so on. The result was a fighting force that was technically proficient within each species unit but catastrophically bad at coordination across species lines. There'd been 3 major incidents in the past decade alone where friendly fire casualties during joint operations exceeded actual enemy casualties. The Accord's military strategists finally admitted what everyone already knew, that separate but equal training wasn't working, and the UEP was born. The idea was elegant if slightly terrifying. Take cadets from 17 different species, dump them into the same training facility and make them learn together. Same instructors, same evaluations, same physical challenges. Let them figure out the gaps. The gaps, as I would learn, were considerable. I arrived at Vorath Prime 3 days before the first major physical assessment. The planet itself was, and I say this as someone who has stood on the surface of a gas giant's atmospheric platform and looked out at swirling methane storms, profoundly unpleasant. It was cold. Not just cold in the way that makes you pull your jacket tighter, but cold in the way that makes you question every life decision that brought you to this particular piece of rock. The sky was a bruised purple-gray, permanently overcast. The wind came off the northern plateaus in sustained gusts that hit like a physical object. The training facility had been built into the side of a cliff face, half underground, its infrastructure connected by a series of pressurized corridors and open-air drill yards enclosed in atmospheric domes. On the morning I arrived, there were 412 cadets in residence. One of them was human. Chapter 1, The Quiet One. I first saw Cadet Marin Voss on the second morning of my residency. She was standing in the corner of the Eastern Mess Hall, eating something that looked like reconstituted protein paste from a gray tray, reading a physical book. Not a data pad, not a neural feed display. An actual book with actual pages, worn soft at the corners. She had one foot propped against the wall behind her, standing in that loose, slightly sideways way that humans sometimes do when they're comfortable somewhere. Like they own the floor they're standing on, but they're not going to make a fuss about it. She was 19 years old, 5 feet 8 inches. Brown hair cut to regulation length, which on humans meant just above the collar. She had a scar above her left eyebrow, thin and pale, the kind you get from something specific and forget to wonder about. Her skin was the color of dried clay, the sort of deep tan that comes from a life lived mostly outdoors. Her eyes, when she glanced up briefly to check the room, more habit than curiosity, I thought, the glance of someone who'd spent a long time making sure of exits, were a very dark brown that looked almost black in the artificial lighting. She was also, as far as I could tell in those first 2 days, completely silent. Not shy, not withdrawn, not the careful, watchful silence of someone afraid of getting something wrong. It was something else, something more deliberate. She ate alone, trained alone as much as the UEP program allowed, and when she was required to interact during group briefings, during assignment distribution, during the interminable administrative processes that constitute the first week of any military enrollment, she answered in the minimum number of words possible. Yes, no, understood, present. The other cadets had noticed. How could they not? 411 beings of various species, most of them chatty in whatever way their biology allowed, and then this one human standing in the corner reading a book like she was waiting for a bus. I asked around. The information I got back was fragmentary, the way information about anyone is fragmentary in the first week before personalities have had time to solidify into reputation. She was from a place called Harrowfield, one of the cadets from the Crethari delegation, a blocky, 6-limbed being named Chorath who had appointed himself the unofficial social organizer of the Eastern Dormitory block, told me this with the particular satisfaction of someone who'd done research. Harrowfield was a frontier settlement on the edge of human-colonized space. Agricultural, mostly, very remote. The kind of place that barely showed up on galactic maps because it had a population of about 3,000 and exported mostly grain and mineral ore, and people who were used to hard work and very long silences. She does not socialize, Chorith told me, clicking his mandibles in what I'd learned was a Krethari expression of mild concern. I have attempted introduction. She acknowledged me. She returned to her book. Is she unfriendly? Chorith considered this for longer than the question probably warranted. Not unfriendly, just, he made a gesture with two of his upper limbs that I didn't have a translation for. Elsewhere. I looked up her enrollment record, which was publicly accessible. The UEP program published basic biographical data on all cadets as part of its transparency initiative. Marin Voss, age 19. Home, Harrowfield Settlement, Voss, Outer Reach, Human Colonial Space. Prior experience, civilian frontier work, 3 years. Emergency medical training, certified. Search and rescue, volunteer, certified. Firearms proficiency, listed as high, which in UEP enrollment language was the second highest classification, and covered a range of weapons platforms broader than most militaries issued to their enlisted personnel in a decade. Physical fitness score, 98th percentile among human applicants. I flagged that last line, 98th percentile among human applicants, not among all species applicants, where the human numbers tended to cluster somewhere in the middle, among humans specifically. She was, by the metrics available to me at enrollment, one of the physically strongest human candidates the UEP had processed. She didn't look it particularly. She was lean rather than visibly muscled, the sort of build that comes from sustained work rather than dedicated gym culture. But I'd been doing this long enough to know that the ones who looked like they were built for endurance usually were. I made a note to watch her. I didn't know then how significant that note would become. Chapter 2, The Instructor. His name was Tactical Instructor Grev Sohul. He was Thuvan, a species I'd encountered before, though not in a military context. Thuvans were large. That was the first thing you registered. Grev Sohul stood 2 meters and 40 centimeters tall, which placed him at the shorter end of adult male Thuvan height. He had the species' characteristic wide, flat torso, 4 upper limbs, 2 primary, 2 secondary, and legs that bent at an angle that looked wrong to human eyes, but allowed for bursts of speed that could cover ground faster than most ground vehicles in short distances. His skin was a deep blue-gray, smooth, and carried the faint bioluminescent striping along his flanks that Thuvans developed through extended physical training. The stripes pulsed faintly when he was calm. They went dark when he was angry. When I met him on the first morning, they were very bright. He was proud, that was the word. Not arrogant. Arrogance implies a lack of substance beneath the confidence, and Grev Sohul had substance. He was a decorated combat veteran of the Second Perimeter War, the holder of 3 commendations of martial excellence from the Galactic Accord, and the highest rated hand-to-hand combat instructor in the Vorath Prime facility. He had trained cadets from 11 different species over 16 years. He had a genuine teaching record that was, by any objective measure, exceptional. He also, as I would discover, had a very specific and very deeply embedded set of beliefs about the galactic hierarchy of physical capability. It was the kind of belief system that doesn't announce itself directly. It lives in the margins, in the small moments, in which cadets he watched with interest during assessments, and which ones he watched with something closer to tolerant patience. He watched Cadet Voss with tolerant patience. In fairness to him, most of the instructors did. The UEP program had enrolled humans before this was Cycle 7, so there was some institutional history, and the general consensus among the facility's veteran instructors was that humans were solid in certain specific areas and required close mentoring in others. They were good with machines, surprisingly good with improvised problem-solving, emotionally durable in ways that species with lower psychological complexity sometimes weren't. But physically, in the metrics that a military training facility spent most of its time measuring, they were middling. Not the weakest species in the program, that designation rotated, depending on the year's enrollment, but not the strongest. Not close to the strongest. I attended the first physical orientation briefing. Instructor Sohul stood at the front of the dome-covered drill yard, 400 cadets arranged in formation around him and went through the program parameters. The UEP Physical Assessment Battery was designed to measure capability relative to species-specific baselines, then assign cross-species conversion scores so that performance could be compared across the enrollment cohort. He explained this in the careful, precise way of someone who'd given this exact speech dozens of times and had stripped it of anything that wasn't load-bearing. Every species has different physical parameters, he said. This program does not punish you for what your biology cannot do. It measures what your biology can do, then holds you to it. The assessments will be hard. They are supposed to be hard. Anyone who finds them not hard enough is welcome to discuss extended parameters with me directly. There was laughter from some sections of the formation. The Crethari contingent, mostly, who had a cultural affection for competitive banter that expressed itself at strange moments. Cadet Voss did not laugh. She stood in the formation with the slightly planted weight-forward stance that I was starting to recognize as her default posture, and she watched Instructor Sohul with that dark, quiet attention. He didn't notice her particularly, or if he did, he didn't show it. That would change. Chapter 3, The Assessment Week. The first 3 days of assessments went as expected, which is to say that they went very well for some cadets and very badly for others, and the results largely confirmed the institutional assumptions that the instructors carried in their heads. The Crethari performed spectacularly on endurance metrics. Their six-limb locomotion gave them a mechanical advantage on terrain navigation that no other enrolled species could match. The Silhari, who were physically smaller and less robust than most species, surprised everyone with their performance on precision coordination tasks, their four-handed dexterity allowing them to complete equipment assembly challenges in times that the instructors had to double-check against the scoring system, because they couldn't believe the numbers. The Thuven cadets, there were 12 of them, all large, all bioluminescent, all looking at every challenge with the focused intensity of people who had been told since birth that physical excellence was a moral virtue, dominated the raw strength assessments by margins that weren't particularly close. The human cadets, there were 4 of them, which was low by enrollment standards but not unusual, performed, as the institutional consensus had predicted, solidly in the middle. 2 of them, a pair from a place called New Geneva, were clearly experienced with military-style physical training and moved through the assessments with practiced competence. The third, a young man from somewhere in the Pacific territories, who had introduced himself to everyone in the dormitory with cheerful enthusiasm, struggled with the Thuvan-weighted endurance components, but made up points on the coordination assessments. And Cadet Voss performed, through the first 3 days, exactly as the institutional consensus expected. She completed everything. She didn't excel by the scoring rubric. She didn't fall behind. She finished assessments in the mid-range and moved on without apparent stress or celebration. Instructor Sohul noticed her in the aggregate way that instructors notice mid-range performers, a brief check against the scoring sheet, a mental categorization, a move to the next name. She was not a problem. She was not a standout. She was, from his perspective, a textbook average-performing human cadet doing exactly what the species had been assessed to do. I watched more carefully, because what I saw, when I watched instead of just recording, was something that didn't fully show up in the scoring rubric. She finished assessments in the mid-range because she was pacing herself. I couldn't prove that, sitting in the observation section with my press pass and my note-taking equipment. But I could see it. I've been watching people long enough, athletes, soldiers, civilians under pressure, to know what maximum effort looks like, what sustained but controlled effort looks like, and what deliberate restraint looks like. Cadet Voss moved through the first 3 days of assessments with a level of physical output that was competent and adequate and clearly, visibly, not her ceiling. Whether she was doing it deliberately, testing the environment before committing to it, the way experienced operators in new territory often do, or whether she simply didn't feel the need to demonstrate anything to anyone, I couldn't tell. I flagged it in my notes. Voss, deliberate moderation, or genuinely average, watch assessment day 4. Assessment day 4 was the combined physical challenge, the UEP program's version of a stress test that compressed multiple physical demands into a single timed sequence. It was designed to measure not just physical capability, but recovery, adaptation, and the ability to perform under sustained load. It was also, because the program committee apparently had a slight sadistic streak, held outside, in the drill yard, without the atmospheric dome engaged. On Vorith Prime, in the wind, I put on every layer I'd brought and went to watch. Chapter 4, Assessment Day 4. The cold that morning was what locals called a plateau wind day, which translated roughly to the northern air masses have decided to descend to ground level and punish everyone who exists on it. The wind was hitting the uncovered drill yard in sustained gusts that I measured at 40 kilometers per hour on the low end, with peaks around 60. The temperature at ground level was approximately negative 12 degrees Celsius in the still air. The wind chill brought that to something my body simply registered as no. Most of the cadets, emerging from the pressurized corridors into the open yard, reacted visibly. The Crethari pulled their external carapaces tight. They had a shutter reflex over their sensory organs that worked like closing shutters against harsh environment. The Silhari clustered slightly, their bodies generating warmth through proximity, an instinctive social response to temperature drop. Several of the Thuven cadets, who were from a warm-world species and found cold genuinely difficult, rolled their bioluminescent stripes into a muted pulse that I'd come to understand was discomfort. Cadet Voss walked into the wind, pulled the collar of her regulation jacket up about an inch, and stood in her default stance like the cold was someone else's problem. The assessment sequence began. The first component was a 3-kilometer terrain run over the facility's obstacle course, rough ground, elevation change, low barriers and high ones, the whole thing. The cadets went off in staggered groups, sorted by species cluster to keep the pacing manageable for the scoring team. The human group went third. I watched from the elevated observation platform, tracking via the scoring team's feed and my own eyes. The course was visible in fragments from where I stood, the starting stretch, the midsection elevation climb, the final approach. Cadet Voss went from the starting line with the same contained, efficient movement that had characterized her first 3 assessment days. The other human cadets paced against each other and against the species score targets the program had given them. She didn't look at them. She ran like someone who has been running across rough ground for a long time and has stopped thinking about it as an activity with a beginning and an end. She finished the terrain run. I checked my feed. Her time put her in the upper third of the human cohort scores, not remarkable, solid. The second component was a strength and load sequence, lifting, carrying, and pressing weights calibrated to species-specific baseline loads. The human load was set at a figure that the program's exercise scientists had derived from broad human population data. It was a challenging figure for most people. It was not, I noted as I watched Cadet Voss complete the sequence without visible strain, a challenging figure for her specifically. She finished the load sequence, upper third again, not remarkable. The third component was the one I'd been waiting for. The UEP called it the resistance scenario. It wasn't, strictly speaking, a physical assessment. It was presented as a tactical judgment exercise. The cadets were given a scenario in which they were required to physically restrain a hostile, played by an instructor in protective padding, for a set period while managing a secondary task. It measured multiple things simultaneously: physical control capability, cognitive function under stress, and what the assessment rubric called situational adaptability. The instructors who played the hostile roles were rotated. For the human cohort's run of the resistance scenario on that morning, the instructor assigned to play the hostile was a senior combat trainer named Veldora, a Crethari female, 6-limbed, with a compact, powerful build that her species developed through military conditioning. She was large for her species, which meant she was approximately equivalent in mass to a large adult human male. She had, I was told later, played the hostile role in over 200 previous assessment runs. She was very good at it. She hit the first of the New Geneva cadets with a controlled strike that was designed to test reaction rather than cause injury, and the cadet managed a reasonable containment response for about 40 seconds before losing positional control. Acceptable score. She hit the second New Geneva cadet similarly, got a slightly better containment performance, noted it on her tablet. She hit the Pacific Territory cadet, who was expecting it and overcorrected, lost his footing on the cold ground, and had to be scored on recovery rather than initial response. Still passing. Then she approached Cadet Voss. And this was where the morning changed. Chapter 5, The Resistance Scenario. Here is what the scoring records show happened, stated plainly. Instructor Veldora initiated the hostile engagement against Cadet Voss at 09:42:07 facility time. The engagement was recorded as terminated at 09:42:09 facility time. 2 seconds. Here is what I actually saw, standing on the observation platform with my eyes and not a scoring tablet. Veldora was good at what she did, and part of what made her good was that she varied her approach. She didn't always come from the same angle. She didn't always lead with the same limb. Against the previous 3 human cadets, she'd used a different entry vector each time, testing whether they were reacting to the motion or to a memorized pattern. Against Cadet Voss, she went fast and low, leading with her primary left limb in a sweeping grab for the collar, a move designed to create momentary loss of balance, which was usually enough to give the assessor a clear look at how the cadet managed destabilization. What happened instead? Cadet Voss didn't step back. She stepped into the grab. Her left hand came up and redirected the incoming limb outward and down, not by blocking it with force, but by catching it at the wrist joint and rotating it along its natural axis. A motion that took the momentum of Veldora's strike and redirected it rather than stopping it. At the same time, her right hand came up and placed itself against Veldora's secondary left limb, the follow-up, the natural continuation of the motion, in a position that, if she'd applied pressure, would have locked the joint. She didn't apply pressure, she stopped. Both of them stopped. There was a pause, 1 breath, maybe 2, where Instructor Veldora was in a compromised position, and Cadet Voss was holding the position without completing it, and the entire observation platform got very quiet. Then Cadet Voss stepped back, released, and stood in her default stance. Veldora straightened up. She looked at Cadet Voss. Her mandibles moved in a way I didn't have a translation for. She marked something on her tablet and moved on to the next cadet. I sat with what I'd just seen for a long time. After the assessments, I found Chorith, the social Krethari, near the equipment storage, and asked him what Veldora's mandible movement had meant, when she'd looked at Cadet Voss afterward. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is the expression my people make when we encounter something that does not fit into the category we had prepared for it." I wrote that down. Chapter 6, What Nobody Told the Instructors. There are things that get lost in enrollment records. A species designation tells you biology. Home world tells you environment. Prior experience categories, civilian, military, frontier, medical, tell you something about function, but they don't tell you the texture of a life. I found out about Harrowfield's settlement from a combination of public archives and one very long conversation with the human administrative liaison assigned to the UEP program, a brisk, efficient woman named Coordinator Asha Trent, who had processed Marin Voss's application personally. Harrowfield was, as Chorith had said, a frontier settlement. What he hadn't mentioned, what didn't make it into the enrollment record under any searchable category, was that it was a frontier settlement on the edge of what human colonial mappers called the Voss Outer Reach, which was, in the honest language of people who lived there rather than the official language of colonial administration, an extremely dangerous place to live. The Voss Outer Reach bordered 3 different contested zones. There was the Threk territorial boundary dispute that had been simmering since the first colonial surveys. There was the proximity to the unmapped belt, a region of space with no effective galactic accord jurisdiction, which in practical terms meant it was home to a freelance economy that included resource extraction, black market trade, and a category of activity that the Accord's diplomatic corps called jurisdictional ambiguity, and that the people who lived near it called pirates. And there was the planet itself. The Voss Outer Reach was mineral-rich and agriculturally viable, but its surface was substantially more hostile than the colonial brochures suggested. Large fauna, variable weather that could swing from livable to lethal in hours. Terrain that rewarded the careful and punished the careless. People who grew up in Harrowfield grew up working. Hard work, physical work, the kind of work that is its own gym. Lifting, hauling, building, repairing, because there is no one else to do it, and things that don't get repaired stop working, and things that stop working in an isolated frontier settlement can kill you. They grew up learning about the terrain because the terrain could kill you if you didn't understand it. They grew up learning to handle emergencies because emergencies happened, and the nearest medical facility was 3 hours away by air transport on a good day, and considerably further away on bad days. And they grew up learning to handle threats, not because they went looking for trouble, but because trouble occasionally came looking for them. Jurisdictional ambiguity had a way of showing up on your door sometimes. Maren Voss, according to Coordinator Trent's careful reading of the application, had grown up doing all of this from approximately the age of 8. Her parents were agricultural operators and emergency response volunteers. Her older brother had been in the colonial militia. She'd been doing physical labor that most adults in settled space would find beyond their capacity since before she was a teenager. She'd been in what the application delicately called 3 documented confrontational situations involving external threats to the settlement before her 17th birthday. She had been doing a version of the resistance scenario, protect what matters, manage the threat, don't flinch, her entire conscious life. None of that was in the enrollment record under any searchable category. The enrollment record said, physical fitness score, 98th percentile among human applicants. And the instructors read that as, very good for a human. Chapter 7, The Silence Explained. I found a moment to speak with Cadet Voss on the evening of assessment day 4. Getting her to agree to talk was itself an experience. I introduced myself outside the mess hall. She was coming out. I was going in, and explained that I was an embedded correspondent, and I'd been observing the assessment program, and I wondered if she'd be willing to speak briefly. She looked at me. Not unfriendly, not hostile. The same dark, quiet attention she turned on everything. About what? She said. About you, I said. About the program, about whatever you want to tell me. She thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought, not performed consideration, then said, all right, 20 minutes. We sat at the far end of the mess hall, away from the main cluster of cadets, and I ran my recorder and asked questions. She was not, as I'd half suspected, silent because she had nothing to say. She was silent because, as she explained in the direct, unembellished way that seemed to be her natural register, she didn't see the point of talking when there was nothing particular to communicate. Back home, she said, there's a lot of quiet, you get used to it. And you figure out that most of what people talk about in places with a lot of people, they're just talking to fill the space. I don't need to fill the space. I asked about Harrowfield. She talked about it the way people talk about a place they love that has also made their life very hard, with a kind of rueful fondness that doesn't minimize the difficulty but doesn't regret it either. The settlement, the seasons, the work, the particular color of the sky in winter when the cloud cover broke for about 2 hours a week and everything turned gold. I asked about the emergency response training. She shrugged. You do what's needed. Someone's hurt, you help them. Someone's threatening something that matters, you deal with it. She paused. I don't think of it as training exactly. It's just what you do. I asked about the assessment that morning, the resistance scenario, what had happened in those 2 seconds. She was quiet for a moment. She came in fast, she said finally. The movement had a natural line, I just followed the line. That was all she would say about it. I asked, as gently as I could, why she wasn't performing at the level I suspected she was capable of. She looked at me with that quiet attention, and something shifted slightly in her expression, not quite a smile, but close to one. I'm learning the place, she said. You don't go to a new place and immediately show everyone what you can do. You watch first. You figure out what matters and what doesn't. You figure out who knows what they're doing and who doesn't. She paused. Then you decide. I looked at her for a moment. And have you decided? I asked. She considered the question. Not yet, she said, and she picked up her book, and that was the end of the 20 minutes. Grev Sohel had been teaching at Vorath Prime for 16 years. He'd seen a great many cadets come through the program and had developed, as experienced instructors inevitably do, an internal taxonomy that he applied to new cohorts. It wasn't conscious arrogance. He would have been genuinely surprised, I think, to have it described that way. It was pattern recognition, the functional compression of 16 years of observation into a set of categories that allowed him to allocate his attention efficiently. Cadets who showed early promise got close attention and active development. Cadets who showed early struggle got remedial support and structured intervention. Cadets who performed in the middle range got monitoring and periodic check-ins, and the assumption that they were doing what they were capable of. Cadet Voss was in the middle range. That was where his attention had categorized her, and that was where it stayed. Until the 5th day of assessments, when he ran the open combat drill himself. The open combat drill was an informal assessment. It didn't count toward the scoring rubric, officially. It was a tradition at Vorath Prime, a holdover from the facility's pre-UEP days when all species cohorts weren't enrolled, and you could calibrate a single species group against a shared set of assumptions. In the UEP era, it had been repurposed as a voluntary skills development exercise. But every cadet who'd been through the program knew that the instructors watched it carefully and remembered what they saw. The format was simple: a mat in the center of the secondary training dome, pairs of cadets drawn by the instructors, controlled engagement, points scored on position, control, and technique rather than force of impact. Nobody actually got hurt in theory. In theory, Instructor Sohul ran the drill personally, which he did twice a year, and which cadets in residence treated as a significant event. He paired the cadets himself, which meant he was also making assessments with every pairing, who he thought was at similar levels, who he thought needed to be tested against something harder, who he was curious about. He paired Cadet Voss with a Thuvan cadet named Geth Soralian. Geth Soralian was 17 years old and already the size of a grown adult Thuvan, which made him approximately equivalent in mass to a large land vehicle. He had been the top scorer in the raw strength assessments among all enrolled cadets, not just the Thuvan cohort. He was good-natured, enthusiastic, and currently bioluminescent with excitement. The pairing, from Sohul's perspective, made a certain kind of institutional sense. He wasn't being cruel. He was doing what experienced instructors do, putting a middle-range cadet against a higher-performing opponent to see what happened. Either Voss found an unexpected gear, which would be interesting, or she got outperformed and learned something from it, which would be useful. Either way, something worth watching. He was not wrong that something worth watching was about to happen. He was entirely wrong about what kind of thing it would be. I was in the observation section when the pairing was called. I heard the murmur move through the cadets around the mat, not quite concern, not quite excitement, but something between the two. Several of the Krethari cadets near me exchanged looks. Chorith, who had appointed himself my unofficial guide to cohort social dynamics, leaned over and said quietly, "This pairing is unusual." "I know," I said. "Soralian is very strong, even by Thuvan standards." "I know," I said again. Cadet Voss walked to the mat. She did not look concerned. She looked, as far as I could read a face I'd been watching for 5 days, mildly interested. Geth Soralian lumbered onto the mat across from her, his bioluminescent stripes pulsing bright with energy, and lowered his head in the brief Thuvan gesture of pre-engagement respect. He was clearly trying not to look like he thought this was going to be short. Instructor Sohul called the start. What happened next took approximately 4 minutes, and was one of the more extraordinary things I have seen in 23 years of reporting. Cadet Voss did not fight Geth Soralian. She moved around him, past him, in patterns that seemed to have no logic until you realized they all had the same logic. She was never where his strength could reach her. He was fast for his size, faster than you'd expect, and his 4 limbs gave him a reach advantage that was simply not something she could overcome with raw positioning. So she didn't try. She moved to his edges, his angles, the places that 4-limbed physiology created as blind spots. Not because she'd studied Thuvan anatomy in a classroom, but because she read bodies, she read movement. She read what a limb's next motion would be from how the weight shifted before it happened, and she got out of the way. She was not winning by the point rubric. She wasn't scoring. She wasn't controlling. She was surviving beautifully in a way that was becoming increasingly uncomfortable to watch from the perspective of Geth Soralian, who had been trying hard for 3 minutes and was starting to look frustrated. And then he overcommitted. He made a reach that was slightly too wide, his right primary limb extending past the angle that his weight could correct for if the grab didn't connect, and she stepped inside it, not away from it, inside, and placed herself in the geometry that you create when you let someone's momentum carry them just past the edge of their own stability. She put her hip against his lower body, caught his extending limb, and turned. He went over. It was a controlled fall. She didn't let him hit the mat hard, and I noticed that, the small, deliberate choice to take the momentum down rather than through him. But he went over, and she was above him for a clear moment with a positional advantage that the scoring system registered as a control point. And then she stepped back and stood in her default stance and waited. The secondary training dome was absolutely silent. Geth Soralian sat up. He looked at her. His bioluminescent stripes went through something I didn't have a reference for, not the muted discomfort pulse, not the bright energy pulse, but something rapid and shifting that I later learned was the Thuvan expression of encountering something that reorganized your understanding of a situation. He burst out laughing. It was an enormous, chest-shaking, entirely genuine laugh, and it broke the silence of the dome like something physical. And then half the cadets around the mat were laughing too, the kind of laughter that comes with released tension. Instructor Grev Sohul was not laughing. He was standing at the edge of the mat, and his bioluminescent stripes had gone completely dark. Let me tell you what changed and what didn't in the 2 weeks that followed the open combat drill. What changed? The cadets started paying attention to Cadet Voss in a new way. Not the vague, puzzled awareness that had characterized the first week, but something more active. Geth Soralian, who turned out to be as good-natured about being outmaneuvered as his laugh had suggested, started eating at the same table as her in the mess hall. A large, cheerful, bioluminescent presence who didn't seem bothered by her silences, and offered a running commentary on the training program that she listened to with the air of someone who finds ambient noise comfortable if not particularly essential. He told everyone who'd listen that the throw was the best thing that had happened to him since he'd arrived at the academy, because it taught him something about his own reach geometry that he hadn't understood before. This was the kind of person Geth Soralian was. Chorith, my Krethari social organizer, incorporated Cadet Voss into his mental model of the cohort as the human who is worth watching, and started pointing her out to other cadets in the way of someone building a consensus. Several of the Silhari cadets, who moved through the world with a particular social awareness that their four-handed precision extended into human interaction, sought her out during evening downtime and discovered that she was, in fact, quite willing to talk if you had something specific to talk about. 2 of them developed what appeared to be a genuine friendship with her over-shared interest in mechanical systems, specifically the propulsion architecture of the transport vehicles that serviced the facility. Cadet Voss, for her part, appeared to notice all of this and file it in the same calm, unhurried way she filed everything, and adjusted her social engagement upward by approximately enough to acknowledge that the world around her contained other people who were worth acknowledging. What didn't change? Instructor Sohul's assessment of her. This surprised me when I registered it. It shouldn't have. I've covered military institutions long enough to know that institutional assessments are slow to update and even slower to reverse completely. And Sohul's taxonomy had Voss in the middle-range category, and one surprising performance in an informal drill does not constitute enough data to move a category. Especially when the surprising performance had a technical explanation. Throw techniques exist, they can be learned and applied. A smaller combatant successfully applying leverage against a larger one is noteworthy but not incomprehensible. He filed it. He moved on. He did not, and this is the part that matters, update his fundamental assumption about what she was capable of. He also did not know what I knew, because I had not yet published any of my reporting, and Coordinator Trent's notes about Harrowfield were not in any file he had access to. And he did not know what Veldora knew, because Veldora had marked something on her tablet the morning of the resistance scenario, and then not spoken about it to anyone until much later. All of these gaps sat quietly in the background while the program continued. And then, on the 17th day of Cycle 7, an external team arrived at Vorath Prime. The Galactic Accord's Military Standards Board sent evaluation teams to UEP facilities twice per enrollment cycle. The teams assessed not just the cadets, but the program itself, the instruction quality, the assessment methodology, the integration outcomes. Instructors were reviewed as thoroughly as cadets. It was a high-stakes week for everyone in the facility, and it generated a specific, slightly brittle atmosphere in the training spaces that I'd observed in previous cycles. This evaluation team was led by a board examiner named Senior Assessor Thravik, a Krethari of significant standing within the board hierarchy, and a figure who had, by institutional reputation, extremely high standards and a very low tolerance for anything that looked like performance calibrated for an audience. She had a particular focus on what the board called species-integrated assessment fidelity, whether the program was actually measuring what it claimed to measure, or whether institutional assumptions about species capability were distorting the results. It was, frankly, the most significant reform focus in the board's current cycle, and she was its most prominent advocate. She arrived with a team of 4 assistants, reviewed 3 days of documentation, and then asked to observe live assessments directly. The assessment she was scheduled to observe on day 5 of the evaluation week was the Advanced Tactical Response Drill, the most complex physical assessment in the UEP battery, a multi-stage scenario involving terrain navigation, equipment operation, and a simulated hostile engagement that required multiple cadets to operate together under instructor-controlled stress conditions. The Advanced Tactical Response Drill was also, I learned from Coordinator Trent, the assessment that Instructor Sohul was most proud of. He designed the current version of it himself over 3 cycles. It was his signature. He ran it with the precision and confidence of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and knows that they know it. He also made a decision about the drill's composition that he would spend a long time afterward re-examining. He assigned the hostile engagement role the center of the drill, the point around which everything else turned, to be played by himself. This was not unusual. He was a decorated combat veteran and the highest-rated hand-to-hand combat instructor in the facility. Playing the hostile himself was a demonstration of confidence in the drill's design and a commitment to the challenge being genuine. He had done it before. What was unusual was his choice of which cadet to put at the center of the hostile engagement as the primary response cadet. He chose Cadet Voss. I didn't understand the decision immediately. I had to piece it together afterward from things I observed and things people told me. The best explanation I arrived at was this. Instructor Sohul had, since the open combat drill, been quietly bothered by what he'd seen. Not because he questioned his assessment of her. He still believed, in the framework he was working from, that the result had been a competent application of a learned technique by a middle-range human cadet against an overextended opponent. But because the board evaluators were watching, and because he knew that Assessor Thravik's team would look closely at any performance data that appeared anomalous, he wanted to contextualize what had happened, put it in a framework that explained it as technique within normal parameters. The way to do that was to put Cadet Voss back in a controlled hostile engagement, one that he controlled, and demonstrate, with the evaluation team watching, that her prior performance had been situational, that under real pressure she would perform within expected human parameters. He genuinely believed this. He wasn't malicious. He wasn't trying to humiliate her. He was trying to provide what he considered accurate context. The problem was that his accurate context was built on an inaccurate foundation. I know all of this because he told me later, in the conversation I will get to. He told me with the particular, painful directness of someone who has done something wrong, and has thought carefully about how and why they did it, and has arrived at an explanation that doesn't exonerate them, but at least has the dignity of honesty. But that was later. On the afternoon of day 5 of the evaluation week, all I knew was what I could observe. The Advanced Tactical Response Drill began. The secondary training dome had been reconfigured for the drill, equipment stations at intervals, terrain elements created from the facility's modular obstacle components, ambient sound and lighting adjusted to create the sensory complexity of an active scenario. Senior Assessor Thravik and her team were in the elevated observation section. Instructor Sohul was on the floor, in the operational space, wearing a full set of protective impact padding. 20 cadets participated in the drill. They came in through the access corridor in small groups, received their scenario parameters from a junior instructor, and took their positions. Cadet Voss entered with the 3rd group. She received her parameters, primary response cadet, center position, hostile engagement point coordinates, and walked to the center of the operational space with the same planted, wait-forward ease she always carried. I was watching her face when she registered that the hostile role was being played by Instructor Sohul. Something moved across her expression, very briefly, not fear, nothing like fear, something more like recognition. The same expression I'd seen on her face during our conversation, when she'd been thinking about a new place and how you learn it before you commit to it. The drill started. The first phase went exactly as designed. The groups navigated the terrain elements, operated the equipment stations, coordinated across the operational space in the way the scenario demanded. Cadet Voss moved through it efficiently, giving terse directional signals to the cadets near her, doing what she was required to do with the same contained competence that characterized everything I'd seen from her. Then Phase 2 initiated. Instructor Sohul moved. He was fast, I want to be clear about this. He was very fast, 2 meters and 40 centimeters of decorated combat veteran, 16 years of training experience, a species that had evolved for precisely this kind of explosive short-distance movement. He'd calibrated the engagement point and the timing with the precision of someone who had done this hundreds of times and knew exactly what he was doing. He came from the left side of the operational space in a diagonal crossing run that was designed to reach Cadet Voss's position in the center before she had a full orientation window. The move was legal within the drill parameters. It was a high-difficulty hostile approach, the kind he used when he wanted to test maximum reaction speed. He'd used it on cadets before. It was difficult but manageable. Against a middle-range human cadet performing within expected parameters. What I saw from the observation section, described as accurately as I can manage. She heard him before she should have been able to hear him. I don't know how the ambient sound fill was significant, and the operational space had multiple other cadets generating movement noise. But she turned before the approach angle was visible from her position, turned and established her footing in the time between one of my heartbeats and the next. He reached her. She wasn't there. Not completely, she was there, but she'd shifted her center of gravity in a way that changed the geometry of his approach by enough that the grab he'd targeted landed in a different place than he'd planned for. And instead of the controlled destabilization he'd expected, he found his own forward momentum carrying him through a space that she'd vacated. He corrected. He was good enough to correct. This wasn't someone who lost control of their body, even surprised. He reset, turned, came again. She moved. This continued for 17 seconds. I know the exact number because the evaluation team's recording system had a timestamp counter that I was able to access later. 17 seconds of Instructor Sohul, decorated, experienced, physically superior by every galactic standard metric, unable to make controlled contact with a 19-year-old human from a frontier settlement. And then he changed tactics. He stopped moving toward her. He stopped and he assessed, and he changed what he was doing in the way that experienced combatants do, abandoning what isn't working and switching to something else. He was a professional. He adapted. He used his reach. His arms, primary limbs, could extend further than a human's reach by a significant margin. He didn't need to get close to make contact. He could make contact from further away than she could respond to if he was patient about it. He extended, he reached. She moved into it. Not away, into. Inside his reach radius, where the length of his limbs became leverage against him rather than advantage for him. And she was inside the reach, and she had her hands in 2 specific places on his extended primary limb, and she turned. The thing about a Thuven turning throw is that it requires knowing the Thuven joint geometry, the pivot points, the angles that the limbs will and won't tolerate, the weight distribution. This is information that is not obviously available to a human cadet in her 3rd week at a multi-species military academy. And yet, he went down. Not as cleanly as Geth Soralian had gone down. Sohul corrected mid-fall, minimized the impact, rolled and came back up, but he went down. And for a moment the floor of the secondary training dome had its highest-ranking instructor on it, and a 19-year-old human standing over him in a position the scoring system would have classified as clear control advantage. He came back up. He stood. He and Cadet Voss looked at each other for 3 seconds. Then he said, and his voice was even professional, completely controlled, drill suspended. All cadets hold position. And the dome was very, very quiet. Chapter 14, The observation platform. I was watching Senior Assessor Thravik. She was Krethari, which meant her mandibles were visible, and Krethari mandible positions were something I'd been studying for long enough to read reasonably well. She was watching the operational floor with the expression of someone whose hypothesis has just been confirmed by data, and her mandibles were in the position that, I had learned from Chorith, indicated finding something that was, in the Krethari value system, excellent. One of her assistants leaned over and said something to her. She shook her head without looking away from the floor. I wrote in my notes, Thravik is very interested in what she just saw. Below us, Instructor Sohul was standing in the center of the operational space, and his bioluminescent stripes were doing something I hadn't seen before. They weren't dark, as they'd been after the open combat drill when he'd been bothered. They weren't the muted discomfort pulse. They were a slow, deep pulse that I later learned, from a Thuven cultural reference document I consulted, was the physical expression of what Thuvens called Sarath, a word that has no direct translation, but occupies the space between recognition, reassessment, and something close to what humans might call the moment when you realize you were wrong. Cadet Voss had returned to her default stance. She was waiting. I was not present for what happened immediately after the drill ended, in the operational space. I was in the observation section, and by the time I got down, the space had been cleared and cadets dispersed to their dormitory blocks. What I know of the next hour and 40 minutes comes from 3 sources: a voluntary statement from Coordinator Trent, a partial account from Chorith who spoke to cadets in Voss's dormitory block, and eventually, a direct account from Instructor Sohul himself. After the drill was suspended, Instructor Sohul dismissed the cadets, left the operational space, and went to his office. He requested a private meeting with Cadet Voss through the administrative channel. She arrived at his office within 12 minutes of the request. They were in the office for an hour and 20 minutes. Here is what Sohul told me, in the direct and painful account he gave when I interviewed him 3 days later. He said that he sat across from her for a long time before he said anything. He was organizing what had happened and what it meant, and what he needed to say about it, which was not a process that came naturally to him because he was, by his own description, a person who had spent 16 years being correct about most things in his professional domain. I told her, he said to me, that I had made an error of assessment, not a technical error, not a mistake in the drill design or the scenario parameters, an error of assumption. I had looked at her enrollment classification and I had looked at her species designation and I had built a picture of what she was capable of, and I had not looked hard enough at the actual person. He paused for a long time, his stripes pulsed slow. In 16 years, he said, I have not had a cadet take me to the floor during a drill. He told me what she said back to him. He said she listened to his entire statement, did not interrupt, did not show discomfort, did not perform false modesty, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I wasn't trying to embarrass you. He said he believed her, that it was immediately obvious she meant it. She told him then about Harrowfield, not everything, not the way she'd told me in the thoughtful, discursive account that had taken 20 minutes. She gave him the essential facts, what the outer reach was, what growing up there required, what she'd learned and how she'd learned it. She told him she'd been learning the academy's environment before committing to what she could do, that she hadn't known what the baseline expectations were, what the culture was, what it would mean to perform at her actual capability in a new environment full of new people, that she'd been watching. She said to me, Sohul told me, I wasn't hiding, I was deciding. He sat with that for a moment. In my interview, he sat with the memory of it in a way that suggested he'd been sitting with it since she'd said it. What did you say? I asked. I asked her what she needed, he said. From the program, from me specifically. What I could do to make the rest of the cycle actually useful to her, given that I'd been operating on an incorrect picture of what she was. He stopped. She thought about it for quite a long time, and then she said, What do you know about Thuven joint mechanics? Because I figured out the geometry in the moment, but I probably missed things. His bioluminescent stripes did the deep, slow pulse of Sarath when he told me that. I watched them. She wanted to learn, he said. She'd just put me on the floor with a technique she'd constructed in 17 seconds from first principles, and what she wanted from the conversation was to know what she'd done wrong. He shook his head, which was not a Thuven gesture. It was one he'd picked up from years of working with multi-species cohorts. "I spent that entire meeting teaching her Thuvan joint mechanics," he said. "She asked excellent questions." Chapter 16, The Evaluation. Senior Assessor Thravik issued her preliminary evaluation findings on day 7 of her team's residency. I got a copy through the press access channel, which provided the public summary. The full report was internal, but the summary was substantial enough to work with. She cited multiple areas of strength in the program. She cited several areas requiring attention. And in the section addressing species-integrated assessment fidelity, she made specific reference to what she called the identification of underdocumented capability as a structural challenge in enrollment assessment design. She did not name Cadet Voss. The report didn't work that way. But the language was precise enough that anyone who'd been in the observation section on day 5 of the evaluation week knew exactly what she was describing. She wrote, and I can paraphrase from the public summary, that enrollment records capture species baseline data and prior experience categories, but frequently fail to capture the experiential texture of candidates from high-demand frontier or non-standard environments, and that this gap creates systematic assessment errors that disadvantage those candidates and simultaneously deprive the program of accurate intelligence about its own cohort's capabilities. She recommended a structural addition to the enrollment process, a standardized, experiential environment survey that would capture detailed information about the lived conditions of candidates' home environments, with specific attention to physical demand profiles, threat exposure histories, and non-institutional skill development. The survey data would be flagged for instructors alongside the standard enrollment record. She also noted in a section on instruction quality that the Vorath Prime facility demonstrated exemplary self-correction capacity in its senior instructional staff, a specific commendation that, given the context, clearly referred to the events of Day 5 and what came after. Instructor Sohul read that section of the report standing in the administrative corridor outside the evaluation team's working room. I happened to be nearby. His stripes did the deep pulse. He didn't say anything. He went back to his office, and I learned later, spent the afternoon revising the assessment intake process for Cycle 8 based on Assessor Thravik's recommendations. He sent a note to Coordinator Trent asking her to contribute her experience with the Voss application to the design of the Experiential Environment Survey Framework. Chapter 17, The Weeks That Followed. The final weeks of Cycle 7 were, I have to say, some of the best I've spent in a military training facility over 23 years of covering them. Part of that was the program itself, which hit its stride in the way that multi-species cohorts sometimes do when the initial friction has been navigated. When 412 beings of 17 different biologies have figured out enough of each other's edges to function as something more than an awkward collective. There were friendships forming and rivalries forming, and the particular institutional culture that every cohort develops as its own. The Krethari and the Silhari discovered a mutual interest in competitive strategy games that resulted in an unofficial tournament that the instructors absolutely knew about and carefully declined to officially acknowledge. The Thuvan cadets and the human cadets developed a complicated ongoing physical challenge exchange that Geth Sorelian organized with the cheerful enthusiasm he applied to everything. Part of it was Cadet Voss, who having apparently decided that the Academy's environment was now sufficiently understood, stopped pacing herself. Watching Marin Voss stop pacing herself was an experience. It wasn't dramatic. That's the thing I want to be clear about. It wasn't a sudden revelation, a superhero moment, a transformation with a capital T. She wasn't a different person. She was the same person, the same quiet, direct, unhurried presence, just no longer modulating her output to the middle of the range. The assessment scores shifted. They shifted considerably. By the end of the cycle, her cumulative performance placed her in the top 15% of all enrolled cadets, across species, not within human cohort ranking, across all 412. In specific assessments, she scored higher. The tactical response drill scores, when the advanced version was run again in the final assessment battery, put her in the top 8%. She completed the cycle. She graduated with commendation, which was the program's second highest distinction. At the graduation ceremony, A procedurally elaborate event that the facility ran with the military precision you'd expect, and a few moments of genuine warmth you wouldn't. Instructor Sohul presented the commendations personally, as was tradition. When he presented Cadet Voss's commendation, he paused for a moment. He said, "This cadet demonstrated that the most important thing a trainer can bring to this work is the understanding that a category is not a ceiling. I learned that from her, and I will not forget it." He said it in Galactic Standard, which meant all 412 cadets and their assembled families and the evaluation team and the press correspondents could understand it. Cadet Voss accepted the commendation. She said, "Thank you, sir." 2 words perfect. A week after graduation, before I filed my final report, I sat down with Cadet Voss one more time. She was packing, leaving for a posting assignment. I won't specify where, because she asked me not to. That was, from what I could tell, a significant opportunity for someone at her stage of a career. She was moving efficiently through the packing with the same practical focus she brought to everything, and she let me sit in the doorway of her room and ask questions. I asked her what the cycle had meant to her. She was quiet for a moment, folding something that looked like several layers of thermal gear. "I learned things," she said. "That's what it's for." "What specifically?" She considered. "That other species are interesting, in ways I didn't know. Geth," she gestured vaguely in the direction of the Thuvan dormitory block. "He thinks about his body differently than I think about mine. He's been taught to think about it as a tool for force. I grew up thinking about mine as a tool for getting through things. Those are different, and both of them have limits that the other one covers." She paused. "The Silhari thing with their hands. I want to understand that better. There's something in how they distribute attention across 4 hands simultaneously that would be interesting to learn." I asked about Instructor Sohul, what she thought of him now. "Good teacher," she said. "Better after." She folded the thermal gear. "He was wrong about me. He knew he was wrong and he said so. That's not nothing," she considered. "Most people would have filed it differently. Found a way to make the data fit what they already thought." I asked how she felt about the moment itself, the drill, the floor, the silence of the dome. She was quiet for longer than usual. "I didn't plan it," she said finally. "I was responding to what was happening. That's what I do." She paused. "But I wasn't sorry it happened. He needed to see it, not because of him specifically, because of what happens when you don't see it." She set the packed bag down. "A lot of people out there are going to look at the record and see what it says about me, what it says about any human or any species, and they're going to make decisions based on that." She looked at me. "The record being more accurate is better for everyone." I asked if she thought it would actually change. If the survey assessor Thravik recommended would actually fix it. She thought about this for a while. "No," she said, "not fix, improve. The assumption is always going to be faster than the evidence. People are made that way. You see a category and you assign it before you look because that's faster and most of the time it's close enough. The thing is," she stopped. "The thing is, the times it's not close enough are the times that matter most. And the ones it gets wrong the worst are always the ones who got to their capability through something the record doesn't have a box for." She picked up the bag. She was clearly done with the conversation, the way she was always clearly done with conversations when she was done with them. "It'll improve," she said. "That's enough." She left the room. I sat in the doorway for a while. Then I went and wrote this. I tracked down Instructor Veldora in the final days of my residency. She was in the assessment scoring office, updating records for the cycle's completion, and she agreed to speak briefly in the corridor outside. I asked her what she'd marked on her tablet that morning of assessment day 4, after the resistance scenario, after 2 seconds. She was quiet for a moment. The Krethari quietness is different from human quietness, the mandibles still. The sensory organs lower slightly. It has a weight to it. "I marked a flag," she said, "on her assessment record for instructor attention." "What kind of flag?" She considered how to say it. "The kind that means, this result is inconsistent with the baseline expectation. Look closer." "Did anyone look?" She was quiet again, longer. "I sent it through the standard channel," she said. "I don't know who received it." I found out later. The flag had been received by the administrative processing system, where it had been queued in the routine assessment review protocol. It had not been forwarded to Instructor Sohul. The administrative review system was automated, and its algorithm had classified the flag as a minor variance note, within expected deviation range for an unusual situational outcome during assessment. It had been filed without additional review. The system had not been designed to look for patterns across species lines. It had been designed to compare individual cadet outcomes against species-specific baselines. A flag noting that a human cadet had performed unusually in a human context would have been escalated. A flag noting that the performance exceeded cross-species expectations didn't fit the system's escalation logic, because the system had been built at a time when cross-species performance comparison wasn't the point. Assessor Thravik's evaluation report cited this, specifically, in her section on systematic assessment gaps. The administrative processing system was being redesigned. Veldora knew none of this when she stood in the corridor with me. "Do you wish someone had looked?" I asked. She was quiet. "The situation resolved," she said finally. She was seen. She paused. "Eventually," she added, and the word carried something I didn't have a translation for. I left Vorath Prime on a transport that departed from the facility's landing platform at 06:00 facility time. The northern plateau wind was down that morning. The sky was still the bruised purple-gray, but it was still for once without the sustained gusts that had been a constant presence for weeks. In the quiet, the sound of the facility came through differently, the distant operational noise of a training complex continuing to function, cadets moving through early morning routines, the ambient hum of the pressurized corridors and the atmospheric domes. I stood on the platform for a few minutes before boarding. Looking out at the cliff face the facility was built into, the half-underground structure, the lights of the various training domes visible in the pre-dawn dark. I thought about categories. I've been a correspondent for 23 years, and in that time I've learned that the most important stories are almost never the ones you went looking for. The most important stories are the ones that happen because you were paying attention to something adjacent to what you were supposed to be covering, and you noticed something that didn't fit the category you'd brought to it, and instead of filing it under minor variance, you followed it. I'd gone to Vorath Prime to cover the Unified Enrollment Program, the institutional innovation, the multi-species cohort dynamics, the assessment methodology. I'd found all of that, it's in this report, but it's not the part I keep thinking about. I keep thinking about a 19-year-old from a frontier settlement standing in the corner of a mess hall reading a book with one foot against the wall, and the 8 months of a specific kind of life that had made her who she was, and the enrollment record that had a score but not a story. I keep thinking about the 2 seconds that the resistance scenario took. I keep thinking about Sorath, the Thuvan word that lives in the space between recognition and reassessment, that a bioluminescent stripe pattern expresses better than most languages can manage. The moment when you understand that you were working with an incomplete picture, and you have to decide what to do with that understanding. Instructor Sohul chose to make his incomplete picture known to the person it concerned, to the evaluators, eventually through Assessor Thravik's report to the institutional record. He didn't have to do that. He could have filed it differently. He's not wrong that he didn't. There's a version of him, probably a common version, in institutions that run on the efficiency of categories, who files it differently, who finds a technical explanation that fits the existing framework and moves on, who never sits across a desk from Marin Voss for an hour and 20 minutes learning exactly how wrong he was. The galaxy runs on a lot of those versions of that choice. It runs on the assumption that the category is close enough, that the flag is within deviation range, that the baseline tells you most of what you need to know. Most of the time, that's probably true. But every now and then, there is a cadet from a place called Harrowfield, standing in a drill yard on a cold morning on a planet she arrived at 3 weeks ago, and the category is not close enough, and the flag is not within deviation range, and the baseline tells you almost nothing you actually need to know. And if you're lucky, the moment comes where you find that out before it matters in a way you can't recover from. And if you're paying attention, really paying attention, the way a correspondent should be, you're watching when it happens. The transport lifted off. Below me, the lights of Vorath Prime Academy shrank and arranged themselves into a pattern. Pressure domes and training facilities and dormitory blocks, all connected, all full of 412 beings from 17 different species, learning together the thing that separate training could never teach, that the being next to you is not what their record says they are. They are what the record hasn't found a box for yet. And you need to know that before you make the mistake of finding out the hard way. I was reviewing archival material for a different story when I found a brief notice in the Galactic Accord's Military Commendations Registry. It was dated 4 months after the conclusion of UEP Cycle 7. It noted that a junior officer assigned to a frontier patrol posting had been cited for meritorious service in connection with a field incident involving coordinated response to a threat against a civilian convoy in a contested jurisdiction zone. The citation was specific about the outcome: multiple civilian lives protected, threat neutralized without casualties among the responding personnel, and complimentary in language I am not going to reproduce here because the officer requested minimal press engagement. The officer's name was listed. I checked my notes from Vorith Prime. I found what I was looking for. I sat with it for a while. Then I wrote, the record still doesn't have a box for her. It still doesn't need one.